Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Autumn and today we are going to be chatting about my cozy fantasy story. Every time I finish a first draft of a project, I like to reevaluate my writing. In the past, I've listed pros and cons, and I won't necessarily be listing pros and cons. In this video, I'm more going to be chatting about my experiences writing this cozy fantasy and my overall thoughts of this project. The last two stories I wrote the first two drafts of and talked about, which I will leave those videos linked down below. Those two projects have been high fantasy stories. This was my first time writing a cozy fantasy story. I figured I would just dive headfirst into doing this. Since it was somewhat of switching gears from writing high fantasy with dark elements and darker tones to those stories, switching gears to writing a cozy fantasy that's low stakes. It's just easy breezy. My characters are just having fun, vibing in a fantasy world. It was a very different experience. Now, it was different in good ways and bad ways. So writing this cozy fantasy, a great way is I feel like it expanded my writing and it challenged it at the same time, and I would consider that being a good thing. Since I have only ever written in one genre, this had given me an opportunity to challenge it, to expand on. For one, there was a romance subplot in this story, so I got to play around a little bit with romance. There was a little bit of a murder mystery that was going on in this cozy fantasy as well. In this story, there was a lot of music and a lot of poetry, songwriting in this story. All of that stuff was a new experience for me. So writing this cozy fantasy let me explore other genres and other creative parts in the writing process that my other two stories haven't let me do in the past. I have never thought to approach a story from lighter tones and just being more humorous, kind of like The Princess Bride. My stories have always been very dark and very heavy hitting. It was a complete 180 from what I was used to. Now, I will say that a bad thing for that was because at the same time of me trying out a new genre, or a new sub-genre of fantasy, I had given myself a deadline that was unrealistic for trying to balance all of those great things, all of those new parts of writing I was dipping my toes into. I was also trying to make myself do all of those things at a faster pace. And I think that combining those things stressed me out. I probably shouldn't have made all of those decisions all at one time, but I did. They were all experiences and we live and learn before I move forward at all. These are just my takes on my writing, my thoughts. They're all just my opinions, but I always feel like it's a really good idea to approach your own writing with a critical eye. You are, yes, your own cheerleader and you should cheer yourself on, but you should also be realistic about your writing and about the craft and about knowing that it's not perfect. And the idea of a first draft is not to get it right on the first try. It's just to throw all of that stuff up so you can fix it later. But you have to be realistic with yourself. And like with me, I know I have to be realistic with my writing in order to improve. With this project, it was just 50,000 words. It was a little over 50,000 words for the completed first draft. With this cozy fantasy, I wrote the first half of this story, the first maybe 22 to 25,000 words of this project fairly quickly, within a month or so. And it also took me 2 weeks to outline this story. The first half of this story, I love. It's probably not perfect, but I love it. It was so fun to write the first half of this story, to get my characters traveling through the world and getting to their end goal, but that was their midpoint. After I wrote the first half of this story, I had to take a hiatus from writing and really from anything that was creative, unfortunately. When I came back to this story after taking 2.5 months off, I want to say it was a very long time. The second 25,000 words of this project, honestly, it's a disaster. It does not match the tone, the atmosphere, the fun lightheartedness that I felt with the first half of this story. And I really truly believe that it is because I took that 2.5-month hiatus. If I hadn't taken that hiatus and I had pushed through and I wrote this story as quickly as I could have in a shorter amount of time, I think I wouldn't have that issue. But because I had chosen to take a step back from my project and then I came back to this story after the hiatus, I defaulted back to writing the high fantasy, the dark voice, the dark tones, because I could feel it in the story. And there were several times when I was writing the second half of this story where I felt myself getting a little dark, and I'm like, Autumn, rein it back in, girlfriend. You are writing a cozy fantasy. I know some of the topics in this story are hard-hitting. You know, there's a murder mystery. Your main characters were abandoned by their parents. I get that there are some hard-hitting topics in the story, but it's still supposed to be lighthearted. I had to keep checking myself with the way I kept defaulting to writing dark and heavy. So I was really upset that the second half of this story really lost that lightheartedness to it. So I know if and when I ever return to this story, I know the second half of this story is for sure gonna have to be rewritten, because it's not what I was going for. Also, within the story, something I think that made me feel a little stagnant, and it was a little bit tougher to write the second half of the story, in addition to the hiatus and getting back into the story and kind of struggling a little bit with that part of it. The first half of this story, my characters are traveling. So you're seeing a lot of the world, and you're really seeing their interaction with the world as they're traveling to their destination. So I feel like that is a very fun thing to see, and you see the different kinds of people in the world and the different cultures. I love that about the first half of this story. And then at the midpoint is when they finally get to their destination, where they have been meaning to be the whole time. They're no longer traveling. I don't want to say that's the mistake, but I think that is what made it more difficult to keep that fun, lighthearted, travel type cozy feeling to the story. I missed the opportunity to compare where they finally settled from the midpoint on. It was so much a missed opportunity that I could have explored how different the setting, the atmosphere, the culture, the people, the environment, how all of that was different from everywhere else that they had traveled. Now that I know that's something I am going to be fixing in this world, and then when I ever return to the story. And I think that was my problem, was adjusting from, oh, the fun, lighthearted traveling band of musicians and they're just having a great time, and then once they get to their destination, making that switch to, well, now they're no longer traveling, there's still this band of bards, but how is this different than where they've come from? That's definitely something that it was for sure a missed opportunity that I could have really had a lot of fun with had I maybe have just kept going with the story instead of taking that hiatus. But you win some, you lose some. That is definitely something when I return back to this project that I will be fixing. It's going to be a lot of work fixing that part of the story. I think it'll be fun too. Oh, I just spilled water all over me. I swear, I have a giant mouth. So if there's a water stain on my shirt, just ignore it. So I wasn't gonna do pros and cons, and this isn't a pro. But one thing I am so proud of myself for doing, because this is something I've been struggling to do in the 4 years I've been writing, I finally outlined the ending of a story before I even started. So when I was outlining this story back in October, I made sure I knew what I wanted my ending to be. I worked backwards. I threw my midpoint in there, and then I worked back to the inciting incident and then the opening of the story. I loved that. It made writing the story easier. I know I said I was struggling through the second half of this story, but it did make writing this project so much easier knowing the ending. I do think it's going to have to change. It'll be critiqued and tweaked a little bit, but I need to make sure I know my ending forever and always before I write a first draft, or if I have to go back and revise a story, I need to look at the ending and be like, okay, well, what ending do I have now? Why does it need to change? And how can it be better? I am so proud that I did that, and I recommend that for anybody, to make sure you know that ending, because it does just save you so much heartbreak and so much stress in the moment. I probably would have been in a fetal position in the corner of the bathroom if I had all these other issues going on with my project and I didn't know the ending. I don't know what I would have done, but it would not have been a great time. So I talked briefly about not necessarily a timeline for this project, but wanting to finish the story at a quicker pace. I mentioned that in this video, but I think I've mentioned that in quite a few videos. Looking back, I honestly can't quite remember what I wanted the original deadline to be. I want to say, since this was a nano project, maybe trying to finish it by the end of November or by the end of December. My idea for this story was to write it at a quicker pace than the stories I've written in the past. One, because I didn't want to be spending 9 months writing one draft. I wanted to write it relatively quickly so I could go back, reread it, revise, rinse, and repeat. And I wanted to do it at a quicker pace. It was just a self thing. Nobody was forcing me to do that. Nobody suggested that. It was just something I wanted to do for myself. When I missed that original deadline, I had pushed it back and I was like, I'll do it by the end of February. And then a whole bunch of nonsense was going on, so I didn't hit that deadline. And so then I was like, yeah, so I will finish this by the end of March. I have to, because I want to be done at this point. I did finish this project by the end of March. I outlined this story 2 weeks in October. October, November, December, January, February, March. So it took me 6 months total, but 5 months of drafting to finish this story. Even though I didn't hit the original deadline, even though I kept pushing that self-imposed deadline back twice, I think, I still wrote this first draft faster than any other story I ever wrote before. I would have to check, but I don't know off the top of my head. I do know it took me more than half the year last year to write my high fantasy story. With that being said, while I didn't follow the original timeline I had for this story and I kept pushing that deadline back, it's not a big deal. It is what it is. Does it suck? Yes. Is it the end of the world? No. I do think that it opened my eyes to reminding myself expectation versus reality. I need to make sure that the expectations I'm setting for my writing and for me, what I can do, are realistic. I would love to be able to write a first draft in 2 months, but is that realistic for my life at that time with that story? No, it obviously wasn't, because it took me a lot longer than that. But I survived it, the story survived it. Even though I'm shelving this project for now, I do have plans to go back to this story. I really do enjoy this story, and I think it's something that would be fun to have on my backlist one day. And the final thing I want to leave all of us on is that I would just finish talking about expectation and reality. I want to say I mentioned this in another video, maybe the one, will I ever be a published author? I want to say it's that one, but I can't remember. Going back to talking about expectation versus reality, I know that writing a good book takes time, and writing a great book takes even longer. So while yes, I've been wanting to write these drafts at a faster pace, but that doesn't mean I have to get it all perfect on the first go. I don't need to throw out a first draft and make sure everything is perfect. I would like to write my first drafts somewhat faster, so then I can go back and take my time once I have that first draft, the foundation and the bones, and then I can go back and slowly build off of that each draft afterwards. But that is what's going to make a good book a great book, is taking my time, making sure I do my due diligence of giving that story the proper TLC it needs to get the message across, also enjoy the story as I'm writing it, and just all of the things about writing a story and getting something that's publishable, getting something out there for the world to see and for the world to connect with. This was definitely a pivotal project in my writing career. I would love for this story to get out into the world. I think it would actually do very well. It needs a lot of work, going off of the last point that I made. It needs a lot of work, and while I would absolutely love to share it, it's going to take time, and I am totally fine with that. And the same with the other projects that I'm also going to be returning to pretty soon. It's all going to take time, but it's all going to be worth that time in the end. While this project was really pivotal in my writing and I learned a whole heck of a lot about myself, about this project, about my writing, I cannot wait to take everything that I talked about with this project and apply it to my next story I'll be working on, and just seeing how my writing is just gonna keep blooming. I am here for it. I'm very excited for the next steps in my writing career. I am happy to announce that I will be returning to Project Ice. That is my high fantasy. It takes place in an icy mountain. We have dangerous creatures that are walking around in this world and a cursed queen. I'm very excited to be getting into that story and rereading the first draft of that and figuring out where I want that story to go and working on revisions of that first draft. So if you're curious about my writing and where all of that is going to go, definitely stay tuned. If you need a little brush up of my experiences with that story, go ahead and watch this playlist. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Autumn and I will see you in the next one. Bye.